Peter Apps is a British global affairs and defense commentator, journalist, and author, best known as a Reuters global defense columnist and commentator on international security, geopolitics, and conflict. He writes a regular bi-weekly column for Thomson Reuters focusing on national security, geopolitical tensions, defense policy, and the evolving nature of conflict around the world. He has authored several books, and of course, that is one of the reasons that we are recording this today, including Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO, and his latest work, The Next World War, which explores the emerging era of great power conflict with significant attention to the war in Ukraine and its implications for global security. Before we jump in, thanks to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, who, of course, adds comments, likes, shares, and all the usual stuff, which helps keep at least this podcast going. And I think it will be important in the coming year that we do keep going because, as Peter is about to explain to us, we are entering something of an uncertain period and possibly a very dangerous period. Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Well, let's dive straight in because, just to hold this up to the viewers, if they like the conversation, they really should have a look at this book, The Next World War. What prompted you to tackle this as the next topic of your book after the previous one examining NATO?
Yeah, really good question. So this book has a subtitle, which is The New Age of Global Conflict and the Fight to Stop It. So, as we were, often with a book, you come up with the sort of larger topic and then you come up with a title. And by the time the Deterring Armageddon came out, which was the beginning of 2024, it was quite clear that we were in a fight to stop the next world war. And this book starts at the beginning of 2024 with various interventions, NATO military committee, the Swedes talking to their population about a coming war. And so it was going to be called Oncoming Storm at one point. But actually, as things got more challenging, and particularly after February of last year, which remember was the J.D. Vance Munich speech, the suspension of military aid to Ukraine by the US for a period of time, we decided to actually bite the bullet and call it the next world war. Not because we're predicting there's a 100% chance the next world war is coming. In the introduction, I said that there's about a 30% chance in the next 10 years, but because it felt like that threat was now in plain sight. It was worth describing it as what it was, and it was worth explicitly making the book about what the next world war would be like if it comes in the coming years, and also, as that subtitle says, that the fight to stop that happening.
And this is an interesting point, isn't it? Because there are those who are going to be sitting here and saying, well, we've seen so many podcasts on this topic, etc., etc. And yet, for some people, myself included, there were already certain warning signs of an impending confrontation from, dare I say it, 2007 onwards. We've got the Munich security speech of Putin. We've got the invasion of Georgia. That absolutely felt to me like, well, here we go. This is not inevitable, but this is a trajectory which could lead to this, that, and the other. And here we are. It feels every move, every desperate step that Putin seems to take as his regime, consumes more and more resources to cling on to power, it feels like we are closer to some form of direct confrontation.
Yeah, I mean, again, as you mentioned, my first book was the history of NATO. So this is the third world war, if it's something that we've been on the edge of. We were on the edge of another third world war for, best part of half a century. From immediately after the Second World War, people start worrying about the Russians pretty much immediately. And by the time NATO is formed in 1949, they're very worried about it. Lots of books imagining what a third world war might look like throughout the 1950s as nuclear weapons get bigger, and then sitting on that sort of edge of nuclear Armageddon from the mid 50s until the mid to late 80s. So we've already worried about a third world war that never happened, and I think what's happening is we're moving back into another one of those eras. Quite a few interesting things about this one. This time, the war we're worried about. So the first point, the war that never happened shaped 50 years of world history, right? So the whole history of the second half of the 21st century, of the 20th century, is shaped by the third world war that never happens. And the same is probably true of the next 30, 40 years of this century. But the war we're worried about now is very different. So in the 90s, or at least it's certainly very different to the one we worried about for most of the Cold War, which was this idea of a nuclear exchange very, very quickly, maybe a week or so of fighting in West Germany, but then this massive exchange of nuclear weapons. That risk of nuclear exchange hasn't gone away, and we've seen that rising. We saw that the India-Pakistan 4-day war of last summer. We saw worries over a nuclear exchange in October of 2022. So that's the first autumn of the Ukraine war, when the Russians were very worried their front line was going to collapse. They were very worried they were going to lose Crimea, and they may go into great lengths to signal to primarily the Americans, but also everyone else in the world, that if that front line collapsed, then they would probably go nuclear. But now, we're not just talking about a European war. I mean, feels like we're talking very much about Russia and Ukraine and NATO at the moment, but the most dangerous place, I would say, is probably still Southeast Asia. The most likely single flashpoint for a major global war is probably a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Again, not inevitable, but certainly a plausible option. Lots of really interesting stuff about when that might happen, what that might look like. And one of the reasons that I wrote this book is that I'd been to Taiwan immediately after the NATO book. I went to Taiwan for about a week and talked to people, including incoming conscripts and government officials and ex-government officials, about what they were worried about. And that's really where this book starts. But obviously it also then goes through Europe. There's a whole chapter on Ukraine. There's a whole chapter on the global south, a whole chapter on the Middle East, a whole chapter on space. And then it sort of looks around both to what's happening now, which, while it's not, I wouldn't say we're in a world war now, but we're certainly not in global peace. That phrase by Blaise Metrovelli, the head of SIS, not at war, not at peace. I think it's very, very apt. And indeed, if we were looking for a different title of the book, that might have been something we went for. But we wanted this book to be about, what should we be worried about a world war? What would it look like? What are the warning signs? What are the places we should look at? And that crucial question: how do we deter and stop it?
And this is quite interesting. I mean, I try to pull myself out of the sort of left-right bubble and making certain distinctions. And something interesting is that, irrespective of whether they were governments of the left or the right, or American version of what's left, which would be far more centrist in the European sense, there seemed to be an absolute understanding until recently that the violation of sovereign borders was the absolute. There's a certain understanding of rules, and violation of sovereign borders is one of the absolute sacrosanct rules. It seems now that we are moving into an understanding of the world, not everywhere, Europe is still resisting that, but moving into understanding of the world based on the so-called spheres of influence, which I think perhaps aligns much more with sort of land-based empires such as China and Russia. What are the new rules of deterrence? What are the new rules in, let's say, a world without rules based on these loose understanding of spheres of influence?
So, I mean, firstly, I think it's a very good point on the rules-based system. I mean, we went to great lengths to try and erect a rules-based system after First World War One, World War Two. The reason was because a world where you could change borders turned out to be a world that was very dangerous. I don't think that idea has gone away, and it's also worth saying that it's always been contested. It didn't stop North Korea invading South Korea. It didn't stop Russia invading Afghanistan. It didn't stop the US invading Iraq. If you lived in the tribal areas of Pakistan, for example, and you were being bombed by drones in the Obama administration, those borders felt a bit less sacrosanct than they do now. And for that matter, Vladimir Putin's Russia was almost certainly killing people on foreign turf and doing things like the Salisbury poisoning throughout quite a lot of that period in the middle. So I think it's a bit less binary than that, but that trajectory is definitely right, and we're definitely moving into an era where the rules apply less. I think is probably the best way of putting it. Where those breaches that were always quite common are becoming more common, and where simply pointing at the rules doesn't work anymore. If you think of the world as a swimming pool, just pointing at the sign on the wall saying you're not allowed to jump in and make a big splash is no longer going to stop people jumping in to make a big splash. What does that mean? I mean, it means that Stephen Miller, Trump's deputy chief of staff, was talking about sort of ancient rules of power, which basically means that if you're big and powerful, you can do more. And if you can, the sort of phrase that some of the Eastern European countries will talk about, which is the world they want to avoid, which is a world where the powerful do what they wish and the weak do what they must. But yes, I mean, fairly simply, this is the rough pub rule world of deterrence, right? So, you don't have, what's the best way of not getting into a fight in a rough pub? It's to look hard, but not too hard, look like you've got friends, but who can look after you, look like you might be the sort of person who the police turn up for, there's a whole bunch of kind of sliding scales of sort of rules of deterrence that everyone's actually quite familiar with, particularly in quite rough environments and neighborhoods. This book, one of the things I say in the introduction is this book is neither a pro nor anti-Trump book. And I think the other point that I think is particularly important to make this week, we're recording this at the end of January, is that it's very easy to describe everything happening in the world as being as a result of Donald Trump. And actually it isn't. Quite a lot of what is happening is Trump unique. You wouldn't have seen the Greenland thing for a different US president. But actually, if you look at things like the US national security strategy, prioritizing China, actually, yes, there's very Trumpish stuff, like the fact it mentions his name 47 times. But actually, I would say 2/3 to 3/4 of that document is actually very similar to what a Biden administration would have produced. And indeed, when you get to the fringes, so J.D. Vance on the more right, someone like Mandami on the sort of more left in the US, you actually end up with quite similarly isolationist foreign policies. So, if we end up we could end up with a right-wing more isolationist president than Trump. We could end up with a left-wing more isolationist president than Trump. So, there's quite a lot going on at the moment.
Of course, it may be that let's say the sort of performative cruelty of the news cycle is something that they don't want to get into. That may be his unique kind of brand, but underlining it, there's some interesting stuff. I want to still stick with this before we head to the evolution of weaponry, because it seems in this new world order, if there is, in the Orwellian sense, three major blocks of power, with Russia, of course, assuming itself that it's one of those, but Europe with an economy sort of whatever it is, 10, 20 times larger, one would suspect that the inverse would be true. But in this world, it's those who are willing to project violence and coercion as opposed to pure economic value. Is it possible that behind the scenes there is not rules, but there is some kind of arbitrage between these that we're not seeing, which is like, okay, we don't want you to go into here. We don't want you to bomb Iran. We don't want you to go into Venezuela. But actually, if you do that, we're going to do this. And you're going to have to, even if you don't like it, you're going to have to sort of suffer the consequences of that. Do you see any evidence of a kind of informal arbitrage between these so-called tripolar powers?
Yeah, so I think, firstly, if you really take lots of steps back, I would say there are three blocks in the world, one of which is the Russia-China bloc with some other authoritarian states, and there are tensions between Russia and China, and there are tensions with those other states. The second, although you wouldn't know it to read the headlines this week, is actually the US, Europe, and the allied nations in Asia, so particularly Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, obviously Taiwan itself. Again, very big tensions within them. And the third is the global South, within which there are arguably even greater tensions. We've seen, for example, most obvious is the Indo-Pakistani 4-day war, the war in Sudan, where you've got UAE on one side, various different players on the other. Even within Yemen, you've got the UAE and Saudi not quite fighting each other, but fighting each other's proxies. So I would say that that's the sort of really big picture. And there is a prospect of a permanent schism with any of those members, so between Russia and China or between the US and Europe. In fact, there almost certainly won't be a permanent schism. There are definitely attempts by the Russians and Chinese to split the Europeans and the Americans. There are efforts by the Americans to split the Russians and Chinese. Those are all worth doing if you're any of those players, but I think most people think they're going to fail. When you look at, say, space exploration, for example, the US and the European space program plus the Japanese, that's probably a pretty overlapping thing. Likewise, the Russians and Chinese, and then you've got the global South who play with both. So the United Arab Emirates, for example, has very sophisticated joint effort with the Russian space program, but also very sophisticated joint effort with NASA. So I think, there is a separate reading of the world, which is sort of imperial blocs clashing against each other short of war. And I think you're right. The most likely scenario, that 70% we don't get a world war, is all about that arbitrage. The Americans need to buy Chinese goods. The Ukraine war is a really interesting example of both Ukraine and Russia buying stuff from China. Zelensky clearly has his own sort of complex relationship. Mark Carney, very upfront about talking about the fact the more aggressive America is to him, the more he'll get into bed with China. So all of those arbitrages are real, but everyone is also dancing around this idea there might be a war. And everyone is dancing around this idea that if there is a war, then realistically, so for example, even if America didn't want to get involved in a war over Taiwan, if Japan is prepared to fight for Taiwan, and it may well be because they're very worried that China would blockade Japan if Taiwan was to fall. It's one of the reasons why the latest national security strategy doesn't mention Taiwan once, but it mentions the first island chain, which includes Taiwan. So it implies that America would fight for Taiwan without saying so. A lot of strategic ambiguity, in the world in general at the moment. By and large, the Chinese are probably going to assume if they attack Japan, then the Americans are going to get involved. I think there's still a working assumption by the Kremlin that if they were to strike a NATO or EU city the way they're routinely striking Lviv or Kyiv, they would probably get some F-35s coming back the other way, and probably the Americans would back that. So I think, yes, lots of underlying but fundamentally people have a fairly strong idea who they're going to fight with if this happens. And even if it never happens, I think those assumptions are going to remain probably pretty common for a while.
Before we carry on with this video, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone who supported the channel through 2025 and all those, of course, who are contemplating supporting us in 2026. We've run many events on the ground in the UK, Europe, and indeed in Ukraine as well. And some of the images of those events are on the screen as you see this. Your assistance has been absolutely invaluable to making it happen. And in 2026, we won't be able to do this scale of activity, have this impact, or even think about having these ambitions without your help and support. There are many ways you can help. Of course, liking, subscribing, making sure you are actually subscribed to the channel, because sometimes YouTube seems to kick people off their subscriptions unexpectedly, but actually also adding comments and sharing materials around your network. It all has a tremendous impact. Now, I know many people watching this channel contribute to Ukrainian charities and do what they can, but aren't necessarily people of huge means. But if you can, if you're able to, and if you see value in this work, please do contribute if you can. We have links to Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and even GoFundMe. That is all in the description of the video. Any support you can give will make sure that we can have not just the same level of impact this year as we did last year, but we can actually increase it. And the aim, in fact, is to double our impact this year, to go from reaching about 1.5 million people per month with our content, doubling that to 3 million, and also doing many more events to help support Ukraine, help support the concept of democracy and resilience. And as we know, 2026 is turning out to be even more dangerous than 2025 was, and the existential threat to democracy, freedom, Ukraine, those aligned with Ukraine, is greater now, perhaps, than it has been at any time since the full-scale war. Thank you for listening to this. Thank you for all of your support. Well, let's dig into those a little more. But first, though, I like your analogy of the, the guy in the pub, or the coming into the pub and, looking like you're not a potential victim there, that you can hold your own and just. But there's also the guy that comes to the pub who looks pretty sort of mean and shabby, but comes along with a really fierce, slightly rabid and unhinged dog, because you're then not looking at him so much. You're thinking about, okay, he's got a crazy dog. Let's hope he doesn't take it off the leash. Is it possible that China is using Russia as the rabid dog just to keep our eyes away from what they're up to, from not turning our sights on them? Perhaps a little bit the role that the Chechens play for Putin's regime, which is, don't upset me because I can let these guys loose on you. And they have no moral framework whatsoever.
I mean, I think there's some. I mean, I think the rabid dog that China keeps on a leash is North Korea, and by tradition, that is that. I think the difference, to slightly anthropomorphize your analogy, in this case, Russia is a sort of China adjacent dog. It wasn't on a leash. It probably didn't tell China it was about to try and bite into Ukraine. I think one of the reasons why Russia is able to continue its war is that it is gradually becoming more in hock to China. And it is becoming less and less an independent actor. If Xi Jinping was to say to Russia, "I need you to stop this war in Ukraine tomorrow," I think that would probably happen. That leads to the obvious conclusion that has not so far happened, and therefore one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin is continuing the war is, firstly, probably because he wants to, but secondly, even if he did not want to, he is probably now in a position where Xi Jinping. It's one of the reasons why I find it a bit amusing. We have all of these this peace deal, Witkov in Ukraine, and all this stuff that's going on. Actually, back in the real world, when you take a step back, if China says the war stops this year, the war will probably stop this year. If China says we'd quite like the war to continue, the war will probably continue. And so there's an element of performative theatre to what's going on. Trump likes that because he likes to, I think when Michael Gove met Trump, he said intelligence comes in different forms. I think one should neither underestimate Trump's intelligence nor his stupidity, because I think he is capable of extremes of both. But I suspect that the relationship that actually the White House puts the most thought into is this relationship with Xi Jinping, most of which is conducted at arm's length, very few direct meetings. Interestingly, the Chinese were in Washington with a fairly senior delegation just after Trump's inauguration, and they couldn't get any Americans to meet them because there weren't any Americans who knew what Trump wanted to say, and therefore no one was willing to say the wrong thing. So everyone had just said, well, I'm sorry, there's no point in meeting me. I'm waiting for the president to decide where he goes. And actually, to be fair, Rahm Emanuel, who was Biden's ambassador to Japan, he said it took the Biden administration a year plus to work out what its strategy was for China. And it would in no sense be a surprise it takes Trump until the middle of 2025 or even the middle of 2026 before he really works out where he stands.
Let's turn then to warfare, because people, when they hear, the next world war, or we're sliding towards this, and they start to see a certain level of rearmament in Europe, maybe not nearly as fast or at scale as it ought to have been, given that we're now in the fifth year of war. But that's where we are. But they're perhaps looking to the patterns of the previous war or the one before that, and in particular, they've looked at the Second World War. The Gulf War is another, perhaps, that people look to their standard. Are there reasons to believe that the next World War will look nothing like the previous one, and actually we may be in it? And for some, will absolutely not see that. It will not touch their lives in that way, and they will not recognize it. For others, it will feel incredibly immediate, and they will see the patterns of global confrontation, as many Ukrainians do at this time.
Yeah, there's an argument that says the Second World War starts sometime around the mid-1930s in Spain and on the Russian-Manchurian border. And yes, actually, if you're Chinese, then the war starts in the mid-1930s and it never stops. And I know there are Ukrainians who believe that is the situation that they're in. Nevertheless, I think if you take a step back, World War II was not underway in 1938, because if it had been underway in 1938, you wouldn't have had Munich and all of those things. And I think that if Ukraine, with the greatest respect to Ukrainians, if the only country being bombed like Ukraine is Ukraine, and to an extent the Russian on the other side, that's not a world war, right? A world war, I think, and this is one of the reasons. We're clearly not in world peace, because world peace would look very different, even a sort of broad world peace like the 1990s, where you have pockets of conflict.
So like the gentle, flabby 1990s, which we grew up in.
Which were absolutely horrific if you were in Grozny or Sarajevo, but felt rather different if you were in Warsaw or Lusaka or all these other places. For example, in a world war, it is going to be incredibly hard to get hold of stuff, whether that is food or fuel or components coming from China, just as it was in the last two world wars. The last two world wars look very different, but they also look very similar. So they were all about supply lines. Iteration of technology was happening phenomenally fast, very like it's happening in Ukraine. So, from one of the sort of intellectual games that I sort of play myself is, how long would it take me to explain the world of today or another part to my great-grandfather's platoon on the Somme? And the answer is, well, not really very long. So if you explain the Ukraine war to them, well, how's it different? It's got fewer people and the planes have got smaller, and more stuff can now be done by radio rather than wires. But there's still a lot of wires. And that's sort of all you need, and actually sort of, okay, fair enough. What does a dugout feel like? Well, a dugout feels exactly the same, because it's just as equally correct.
And the tanks that transformed your battlefield don't work anymore.
Exactly. But on the other hand, actually, the tank that, although ironically, the Russian tank that looks like a bomb that just went past your front door looks more like a tank of 1916 than any tanks of the intervening 110 years. Likewise, the Second World War, the iteration is different. If we do go over the edge, I think we will see, some commonalities of the previous war. Obviously, supply lines will be a big deal. I think small craft, small hidden craft that can sink ships, submarines in the two world wars, submarines again in a third world war, but many more of them will be unmanned. Although, to be fair, a torpedo is simply an unmanned drone anyway, so it's a matter of degree. London was taking intermediate range ballistic missile hits between 1944 and 1945, very similar to what Kyiv is taking today, and not with a huge degree lesser or greater accuracy, in fact. I think obviously, mass call-up populations in the way that Ukraine has had. I think Ukraine has done some. Ukraine and Russia is the first war between shrinking populations. And if you look at how both Russia and Ukraine have found their recruits, that is quite interesting. By and large, men in their 30s, 40s, 50s. Both countries have found, I hate to say, sort of quite large surplus populations of men people don't care about in the way they care about 18, 19, 25-year-olds. Ukrainians and Russians have gone to great lengths not to conscript their teenagers. There's probably a lesson there for any combatants in a coming conflict. When we talk about conscription in the UK, we sort of think about teenagers. I suspect if we were actually looking for soldiers, that's not where we'd go. I think most mothers I know in Britain would rather see their entire husband's generation conscripted before they sort of broke open the teenagers. And I think those would be, as they've been in Ukraine, live political discussions, and even more so in China, where despite the fact that you don't have these discussions in public, there is still a way by which the Chinese Communist Party sort of negotiates. Again, really big developments. The last weekend, everyone's talking about Trump, everyone's talking about Greenland. Actually, the important development may well be that Xi Jinping fired General Zhang, his boyhood friend, grew up together in exile in Shaanxi in central China. General Zhang fought the Vietnamese in the 70s, has been Xi's military right-hand man throughout the 2010s, appears to have been arrested, at the very least removed from power over corruption, and they had been the pair who would decide whether to invade Taiwan. The guy who would invade Taiwan, Eastern Theater Commander, also seems to have been arrested. Again, this is since I wrote the book. In the book, these are the two big, I do a bit of a profile of both of them. These are the two big decision makers who will decide to invade Taiwan. By the time that book has come out, both of them have almost certainly been arrested. So lots of really big stuff going on. Again, there are comparisons to the 1930s. America also not devoid of military purges, a whole bunch of military commanders fired. I think there's no doubt that the US sort of chain of command is working more functionally. The Chinese chain of command is probably working more functionally than the Russian chain of command. The Ukrainian chain of command is a reminder that it's all about egos. One of the chapters of the book looks at the relationship of people like General Zaluzhny, General Chris Donahue, who was the now commander of US Army Europe, was the kind of US Army lead on supporting Ukraine. I think that big clash of egos and generals is one of the things that I think is a story we're only just beginning to understand about Ukraine. People will be relitigating that for 50 years, the same way Montgomery and Patton and so forth were after World War II. Or at least Montgomery and Patton and their defenders. Patton obviously doesn't dies in 1945. But I think there's the pre-war period will taste the same, the war will taste the same, and also, and this is the most important point, the most likely comparison is those first sort of 25, 30 years of the Cold War, because the most likely scenario is that we're in a 20-year period where, yes, there were wars. Ukraine, I think, is very similar to the Korean War, very high number of casualties. I suspect the front lines will end up not a million miles away from where they started. I don't think Ukraine is going to get Crimea back. The Donbass, I don't feel like either side, when they really look at it, will conclude that the sheer amount of people that they've lost is worth it for what is likely to be 10, 20, 30, 40 miles of Donbass. And actually, again, the last 2 years of the Korean War, the front line barely moved. The last, we don't know, this war's been going on for 4 years now, but actually, the amount of really significant movement in the last year is minute. We could easily fight another 2 or 3 years. And yes, the Russians will gradually push forward, probably, but we are not talking a huge amount of terrain being exchanged. And in the case of the Korean War, it only really ended when one side threatened to use nuclear weapons to bring it to a conclusion. And I think certainly, if the Ukrainians are going to win, that's what happened, because the Russians would make it very clear where their red line was, and the Americans would almost certainly force the Ukrainians not to push any further forward.
And that, to an extent, is perhaps something we saw in 2022, I think, when Ukraine was persuaded not to go further and faster in the retaking of Kherson.
Up to a point, although, there's a bit of my book which is heavily lifted from reporting from the New York Times. But Chris Donahue, U.S. Army general, was very keen that they push hard forward. The White House was unquestionably keen that they did not, because they thought that would lead to a nuclear exchange. So again, that clash of egos. You could easily have been in a position where a U.S. president wanted to take Crimea and a U.S. general didn't. The other way around on this occasion. But those kind of things, those dynamics are fairly kind of not universal, because they don't happen all the time, but I think they're universal to post-1950 superpower clashes.
Now, I'm sure Vladimir Putin would have wanted to take all of Ukraine. It was clearly his intent to do so, and then push on through to Moldova and take that whole Novorossiya kind of coastline. We can see strategically, economically, why that would have been important as well.
And I think there is a suggestion, which Zelensky has alluded to, that the Americans were prepared to allow that to happen, that the American preferred option was to get Zelensky out, let the Russians take the whole of Ukraine, move on to a hard border. Maybe, what would happen to Moldova then, I think is an open question, but, the front line would be one side of Moldova or the other. And that the Americans were quite open, as indeed were the British initially, talking about there'll be no troops in Ukraine. It's only when it becomes clear Zelensky is going to fight. I mean, ironically, one of the things about the book is that everyone talks about the sort of US intelligence being right and European intelligence being wrong about the invasion of Ukraine. It's actually not quite so binary. US intelligence was correct, the invasion was coming, but they were wrong that they would overrun Ukraine. European intelligence was correct that the Russians lacked the combat power to take Ukraine, but they were wrong that that meant the invasion wasn't coming. So, and the Ukrainians held a variety of different views, but the ones who were really useful to Zelensky in the opening stages of the war were those who had got the correct bit of both of those, realized the invasion was coming, but realized that they could hold Kyiv if they had to.
But there, of course, there were many who just didn't want to believe it in Kiev, in the administration and the civilian population.
And I think there were many who decided. I mean, I think one of the other things that's fairly obvious is that the sensible thing, quote unquote, was to wait to see how the first 24 hours progressed. Once it was clear Ukraine was going to survive, then yes, you could fight. But quite a lot of units seem to hold back, because there's no point in just being shot against the wall by the Russians at the end of the day when Zelensky might have been on a plane to Poland or Costa Rica. Only when it was clear that the fight was actually going to happen did Ukrainian society, and particularly Ukrainian power and money and quite a lot of military muscle, drop into position behind that government.
That's it. And dare I say it, there were quite a few people, no doubt, within these structures of government who would have taken money from Russia in the preceding years. So, of course, they wouldn't want to be seen to be resisting having taken that. Now, we won't know the extent of that. But
also plenty who were not prepared to take money from Russia, but also weren't prepared to waste their lives pointlessly. Yes. Only when they realized that actually it was a winnable fight. And this is where the face-off over Taiwan is interesting, because what you see at the moment is a live battle for the hearts and minds of Taiwan, Taiwanese commanders, everything else, because the Chinese would like it to be a fait accompli and no one to fight. Obviously, the Taiwanese would, who want to maintain their independence, want to make sure that the Ukraine scenario is the one that prevails. And the simple truth is that in reality, it will be the Ukraine scenario, by which I mean the first 24-hour battle for the capital will be critical. The first 24-hour battle for the runways will be critical. And, it will be a mixture of, high-end SOF and high-end strike and people who join the army in the morning, which will come together to determine whether that fight goes one way or the other. And a lot of... And the other thing, I mean, had Russian airborne forces been prepared to risk more forces on Hostomel Airport, had they been prepared to, say, lose 25, 30 airframes to get enough, then things might have gone very differently. They also they decided not to risk that. And that is one of the reasons why Kyiv got to fight another day.
That's it. And they almost certainly surprised, not prepared for that scale of resistance, even if the forces were relatively small. I mean, that must have taken them by surprise. I suspect Moldova would not have put up much of a fight, unfortunately.
I think the point with Moldova, and I mean, you're aware of this, but some of your listeners may forget about it, is that Moldova is either pretty safe because it's surrounded by Ukraine and Romania, or if the whole of Ukraine falls, obviously, then it's immediately
massively vulnerable.
You have to overrun the whole of Ukraine, and of course, that looks less and less plausible. We're currently in a conversation about whether Ukraine can hold the Donbass. And you don't have to be a pessimist to think the answer is no, to think that Ukraine can still hold the remainder of Ukraine.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And there's, we'll come to that transparency of the battlefield, but now Russia's infiltrated a number of towns. There's a lot of green open space, and you'll have seen the footage, not just the sort of the clickbait stuff, but it seems that with the saturation of the battlefield, having large swathes of green open space you need to overcome for the next big urban fight. That does not suggest, at least to me, that Russia has much chance of penetrating that much deeper into Ukraine at this
Yeah, I mean, I
point.
think it's. I mean, the interesting thing about drones is that, yeah, and this is not a binary battle. Is you have the transition from good tank country, which Ukraine unquestionably is, to good drone country. But of course, that does also mean that a Russian breakthrough in electronic warfare that was able to turn off all Ukrainian drones for a 100-hour period is probably all you need to smash across that. And I think if you look at certainly the capabilities the Americans are looking at building up, their ability to protect a forward-moving force from both drone and missile attack with a mixture of lasers and EW and other things is right at the heart of what they are looking at doing, and also using long-range strikes. So I think don't and also if we do get a ceasefire, the Russians will almost certainly in any confrontation put lots of troops in Belarus, and that leaves open that corridor to punch down to Kyiv again. Where's that coalition of the willing going to go? Well, I know where the Ukrainians want it. Where the Ukrainians want it is a blocking position north of Kyiv. But again, the truth is, if you're talking about an Anglo-French battle group brigade, if the Russians are coming for Kyiv, they're not going to make the mistake they did last time. Chinese writing on the Ukraine war is interesting. Chinese writing on the Ukraine war is very simple. It says the Russians thought they were going to be able to take Ukraine without fighting. That was a fatal error. We must never make that mistake again. And they will certainly be telling the Russians that, but I think the Russians have probably got that lesson now. The Russians are not going to fight another fight where they do not believe they have enough forces to do the job properly, and where they do not believe they have enough stores to be able to outlast the West. And if that doesn't happen, and the new US national security strategy is very clear on this, whereas the national security strategy says Europe is weak and will collapse. The defense strategy says Europe actually has a huge amount of money and industry and should be perfectly capable of deterring Russia, and the Americans are really up for helping with a bit of capability, which means primarily nuclear defense, intelligence, fast air, long range strike, and yes, some ability to stiffen European forces in the field, but also tripwire forces. I don't think the US is talking right now about pulling out detachments like it's 14 tanks in Estonia. Tiny force, but it does, as long as there are 14 tanks in Estonia, I sleep relatively well at night thinking the Russians aren't coming into Estonia. And I think that is the way the Pentagon thinks. I suspect quietly it's the way Trump thinks and Pete Hegseth thinks, because Pete Hegseth met with the Baltics quite a lot. We're going to have to relitigate it, to quote J.D. Vance, every winter, again and again and again. But as long as those 14 tanks are there, or something equivalent American size, I don't think the Russians are coming. And you never know, actually, maybe the Americans will not have a permanent presence in Ukraine. But when you look quite closely, you'll discover that there are 10 US tanks, 100 National Guardsmen, whatever, just north of Kyiv. And maybe that will have an effect.
And special forces, which of course the adversary will be aware of again, that not necessarily
Yes,
disclosed. Yeah.
except that it's very clear that US and British special forces were pulled out of Ukraine before the invasion in 2022. And both the Chinese and the Russians, if they were coming for a country again, would again signal very clearly that they would want those forces withdrawn. And they may well judge that because that's what happened in 2022, it might happen again.
The last thing I think we've got time for is to take something you said a second ago, which is that Russia is not got very far from where it started in the Donbass. I mean, Donetsk is still within a short car ride away. Well, assuming you get a car through there. But judging success either externally and certainly internally within the regime isn't based on that alone. This war has become a catalyst for them to essentially sharp the cracks in NATO, to try and fragment and fracture the alliance, to accelerate the disintegration of the post-World War order. Putin would say that actually it's been an extraordinary catalyst of change in Russia's favor, and that we cannot look at it in terms of territory.
I mean, I think that's half right, but I think it's also very, very wrong in other ways. So, I mean, firstly, it's shown up several things, including Russia's ability to last a long time in a long war. It has definitely given us the case study that democracies are not weak and do not necessarily fall over. So this idea that democracies were weak, even very, very imperfect, incredibly divided democracies like Ukraine, I think anyone would struggle to describe Ukraine as one of the most successful democracies of any the modern era, and yet it still proved the ability to fight. I think getting Finland into NATO and Sweden into NATO is a huge deal because Russia's, not soft underbelly, but vulnerable point is those facilities around Murmansk, home to their Northern Fleet, home to their nuclear deterrent. They can now be struck very easily with long-range rockets and F-35 striking out of Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and that is a strategic loss for the Kremlin. I would argue that in the long run, the dependence on China will be seen as a strategic loss. I think, and I think the invasion of Ukraine will be seen as a mistake. It is not going to be a great surprise that Putin, as long as he's alive, needs to present it as a success and find ways of doing that, just as he needed to present Afghanistan as a success and Iraq as a success for people who did those things for as long as they possibly could. But I think what Ukraine has done, which has been seismic, and I don't know whether it makes a war more or less likely, is it has if you look even on YouTube, there's a YouTube channel called the Next World War, same title as my book, but it started about 3 years ago, and its assumption of the war in the Baltic states is that we're talking about battle group sized NATO forces, we're talking about few Russian brigades, the scale of potential warfare has been increased, on the monumental scale. We're now looking at a clash of populations that looks more like World War One. You're looking at how many millions of men you can recruit, men and women. You're looking at literally how many soldiers and how much industry you can get out of your whole country. Yes, AI is part of that, but but nevertheless, I think the scale of a conflict that you now have to be prepared for is exponentially larger. And I don't think that would necessarily have happened without the invasion of Ukraine. I think we might have stayed in a much more professionalized kind of world where it looked like Taiwan could be taken by the professional PLA, where Europe looked like it was not going to have, people wouldn't have talked about conscription. So I think in that sense, it's been a game changer. And I suppose, and to the last point, it's an important one, is in Russia's favor if you're looking at attacking Ukraine, it's a larger population, or the Baltic states, because the population overmatch is enormous. It is not in Russia's favor if you're fighting the whole of European Union, because the European Union has between twice and three times as many population, depending on whether you're talking about sort of mainland Europe, EU plus NATO, different kinds of measures. But either way, the population overmatch is quite enormous if Russia is fighting the whole of Europe.
And the last sort of point on there, again, Russia may well look at this, and whoever succeeds Putin may say, look, this large-scale kinetic confrontation, unless we fully are supplied by the Chinese, this is not going to go in our favor. But could they still believe they may win a hybridized, an at-scale hybrid confrontation where they look to destroy our economic base, our communications, to sow chaos, and combine it with a full informational assault to destabilize individual governments, tear apart institutions, this kind of stuff?
Well, so I think there's an element of that, but also don't forget they don't have to win, because for Russia, which is everyone says the economy size of New York State or Italy, simply being part of that confrontation is a win. We don't have to fall apart. They'd like us to, but even if we don't, Russia is acting as a great power, not as great as the US, not as great as China, but it's allowing it to punch at least an equal scale to Germany, despite having an economy that's a fraction of its size. So even if the war never happens, in some ways, particularly if the war never happens, because they might well lose it, there is no doubt that more than for any other individual state, with the possible exception of North Korea, which again is an economy the size of, I think, Jacksonville, Florida, there is no question that for Russia, a world that is on the edge of a global war is a world in which Russia is one of the most powerful states in the world. A world which is not on the edge of a global war is a world in which Russia is not particularly powerful. The Chinese have a very different relationship with it. They'd like being a military superpower, but they have a lot more to lose from actual conflict, because, as with Japan in the 1940s, they could lose everything. But also, the Chinese could demobilize the entire PLA tomorrow, or adopt a Swiss constitution or whatever, and they would still be one of the most powerful nations in the world. and indeed they that is the you know for us, it's for Britain, it's incredibly important that we think about Europe. For Ukraine, it's a systemic battle for survival. If you are Russian, sorry, if you're Russian, it's important. But if you are American or Chinese, you actually view the world in a more or less binary way, and all of those other considerations are a bit secondary. So that's the I mean, again, this struggle for the world. So battle for the world. It's definitely a game on. That is definitely going to happen. World war, maybe, maybe not. Probably sitting on the edge of it. That's good news for Russia, and therefore we can expect them to do pretty much whatever they need to make sure that we remain on edge and worried about their military capability, because basically we stopped worrying about their military capability in the 90s and we treated them like Albania, and they didn't enjoy it.
That's it. Dare I say it, without that existential external threat, it becomes far harder to hold that illogical empire and vast territory together. But
one last point as well, which I think that if you listen to what the Russians say to people like Jens Stoltenberg, they say we have been attacked out of Europe by a psychopath every century since the 17th. So Charles XII of Sweden, Napoleon, Hitler. The 21st century is not very old yet, and we anticipate a Western psychopath at some stage within the century, and everything we're doing is to prepare for that. Now, if that was what your plan was, I'm not sure that Russia's hybrid warfare interfering in German, French, and American politics has been very clever, because I think they are unquestionably nudging European and Western politics in dodgy directions. But there is no doubt that amongst the the sensible Russian element of thinking, which has always been present there, a lot of them are looking at the world, and they will particularly looking at the world stuff with happening in Greenland and so forth, and going, well, actually, can we bet the farm that there won't be a Western attempt to overrun Russia in the 2050s? No, we can't. And again, I think this is also how Russia is deterred, because if Russia kickstarts a massive war in Europe, then it's certainly at risk of losing Kaliningrad permanently. It might even be at risk of losing St. Petersburg permanently, and definitely Crimea. Now, yes, Russia could burn the world down to stop that happening, but that is, that's not a great option for anyone either. So I think, there's no question that certainly the Poles, the Ukrainians, if it came over the edge, their aim would be to leave Russia very much shrunken. And that itself is hopefully a very effective deterrent. Yes, Russia would like Narva in Estonia, Russian-speaking city, but are they going to try and take Narva at the risk of losing St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad and Crimea? Maybe not. So that's where the deterrence comes in.
That's it. And they wanted to turn Eastern Ukraine, in fact, all of Ukraine, into a basket case. I wonder whether that's actually their policy for the whole of Europe now, not to overwhelm it, but to keep it as an unstable basket case that they can control and get hooked on their resources. And it's one of the lines of thinking, maybe.
No, definitely. But I think I don't think they necessarily think they can control it. But I think even if they can influence it, they think that is a win. And they might be able to control it. I mean, we might still have, we could have pro-Putin governments in Berlin and Paris within 5 years. So that could,
and London, dare I say,
it wouldn't be controlled because those governments would be very powerful in their own right. Yeah. But you could have they might be prepared to do a Russia-Franco-German triumvirate. As to whether the Russians would be up for that deal is another question, because they would potentially be the weak party in that, and they have lots to lose from those kind of dynamics. But Europe could head in a very different direction.
Dare say Farage would be far more Kremlin aligned than any other regime we might have seen, or administration we might have seen as well. Yes, so it could be three major countries.
Simultaneously, probably less aligned than a far right in France or Germany. So I think there is because I find it hard to imagine Farage abandoning the US relationship in the way that So I think and I think the Franco-German parties have different characteristics. So I think it is there are. And I also, I could also imagine a Russian right-wing proxy to the right of Farage leaping up under certain circumstances. So there's quite a lot to play for.
Absolutely. Stable it is not. Peter, thank you for coming on. There are so many different topics and directions that could still go in. So possibly in the future, I look forward to continuing the conversation. For today, your book comes highly recommended, and the themes you cover, in fact, I think it's absolutely essential for people who are following geopolitics at this time and take an interest in it. But thank you for coming back. Oh, not back on. Thank you for coming on.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan.